It sure feels good to hug a tree. You know, the expression tree hugger is something people sometimes use as a derogatory way of referring to environmentalists. I'm not sure why, but I think it has something to do with the idea that hugs are supposed to be for people, not for plants. I'm not sure Aldo Leopold would agree, though. As far as he's concerned, the primary object of our moral concern isn't particular other people, or even particular other animals. Our primary moral concern should be for the biosphere as a whole. In short, if he could have his way, Leopold would want to give a hug to all of this. Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac is one of the great classics of American environmental writing. It's a beautiful book, and I strongly recommend it if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. Leopold writes with sensitivity and beauty and with a gentle humor about the land that he loves. And the final chapter of the book outlines what he calls a land ethic. And he handily gives us a one-sentence summary of that land ethic. He says, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." That's actually two sentences, but you get the idea. So the first question then, obviously, is what Leopold means by a biotic community. And his point is that we and animals and plants and the soils and the waters are all interconnected. We all form part of one integrated community. And for him, an appropriate ethic is one that takes that entire community into account. The traditional ethics encourage us to care for the human community, to recognize that we can't selfishly pursue our own goals at the expense of others, that we're all part of one big human community. And part of Leopold's point is to say we need to expand our sense of what community we belong to, so that we recognize that the community that we're a part of isn't simply a human community, but as he puts it, a biotic community. Now, Leopold doesn't explore this point explicitly, but the idea of a land ethic actually comes into an interesting tension with certain ideas about specifically animal rights. But let me take a step back from that and suggest that there are a range of different options that you could consider if you want to ask who is deserving of moral concern. Now, traditionally, the answer has been the moral community is the human community. Other human beings share lives with us. They too are rational, moral agents to whom we can make promises, have expectations, and so on. And it's only within this human community that there are moral obligations. Some have argued, and this goes back to ancient Greece and ancient India, but it's gained a certain kind of salience in the last half century or so, that animals also are deserving of moral consideration. To the extent that a human being matters because they can suffer, things can go badly for them and can go well for them, that they have interests, they have experiences. All of this is true, at least of a large number of animals. And so a lot of animal ethicists will argue that for these reasons we should expand the community of moral concern to include not just humans, but also non-human animals. There are some, like the philosophers Richard Sylvan or Paul W. Taylor, who've argued that we should consider living organisms in general. That it's not just sentient animals that have rights or deserve moral consideration, but also plants, for example. That although a plant might not be able to have an experience of suffering, they don't have the sort of the neurological pathways that humans and other sentient animals have, they're nevertheless, as Taylor describes them, teleological centers of life. There are certain things that plants clearly want in some loose sense of that word. You know, they turn toward the light, they fend off pests, they spread their seeds around. There's a sense of goal-orientedness, not just among sentient humans and animals, but also among living organisms in general. And as far as someone like Taylor is concerned, living organisms in general warrant our moral concern. Now, the land ethic that Aldo Leopold articulates, and this is one that has received further philosophical elaboration, most notably by the philosopher J. Baird Callicott, is one that says it's not just individual humans, animals, plants, whatever else that warrant moral consideration, but the biosphere in general, the biotic community in general, which includes non-living things like soils and waters and so on. But also the point is that this is a holistic ethic. It's not saying this particular animal or this particular plant deserves moral consideration, but rather we need to take into account the needs of the community as a whole, the ecosystem as a whole. And that's one that supersedes the needs of the particular individuals that make it up. Now, part of the tension here is that the needs of the ecosystem as a whole sometimes come into conflict with the needs of the individuals who make it up. Take, for example, the familiar case of overgrazing by deer. There are certain ecosystems that are placed under strain because the deer population is very large. They start overgrazing, destroying the foliage, putting strain on the ecosystem and other creatures around them. For many wildlife managers, this is reason to cull the deer, to make a limited number of kills of deer, to reduce their numbers for the sake of the ecosystem more broadly. And you can see how, according to a land ethic, in certain instances, a cull might be an appropriate thing to do. On the other hand, if you're an advocate of animal rights, you would argue that individual animals, like individual humans, have inviolable rights, among which is the right not to be killed. That in the same way that there are many things that you can do to restrain human behavior, it is not okay to wantonly kill human beings for the sake of some larger whole. Likewise, an animal rights advocate would say it's not okay to kill deer, even if it's for the betterment of the ecosystem as a whole. And what's more, the animal rights advocate would say, look, if you're willing to cull deer for the sake of the ecosystem, but you're not willing to cull humans for the sake of the ecosystem, you're not really embracing a land ethic at all. What you're doing is being anthropocentric and valuing human life over and above animal life, and maybe caring about the ecosystem as well. On the other hand, if you are willing to kill humans, well, that puts you on what we might call the eco-fascist fringe, and that's obviously not a desirable position either. And so you can see here, and I'm not going to try to resolve the tension here, but there is a tension between having concern for the ecosystem as a whole and having concern for the particular individual animals, humans, plants that make it up. And this tension isn't one that I think can be easily or straightforwardly resolved, that sometimes benefiting the ecosystem as a whole does require harming individuals within that ecosystem. And if you hold those individual lives as sacrosanct, that might come at some cost to the ecosystem. Now, these are all debates that have played themselves out in philosophical contexts with philosophers like Callcott or Taylor or various animal rights ethicists such as Tom Regan or Peter Singer arguing out different positions. None of this really touches what Leopold himself writes, though. Leopold isn't a professional philosopher. He was writing in the 1940s, well before these sorts of philosophical debates started getting serious traction. And it's worth asking, to what extent is Leopold, when he articulates a land ethic, is he actually taking a stand in this philosophical debate? It might be a bit anachronistic to say so, since that debate didn't exist at the time that he was writing. But it's also worth considering the style in which he writes. That Leopold isn't writing as a philosopher, and he's not really providing any kind of rigorous argument for why we should prioritize the land. Instead of providing strict, rigorous philosophical argument, a lot of what he tries to do is to transform our way of seeing. For instance, he lays out what he describes as a land pyramid. He wants us to recognize the way in which different organisms within an ecosystem are connected to one another. So in this pyramid, you have predators at the top, and then a lower rung of their prey, and then insects and plants and soils. The idea being that to sustain one predator's life, you need a lot of prey species. To sustain those prey species' lives, you need a large number of plants for them to feed on, and so on and so forth. And so the idea then is that there are various food chains by which humans and animals and plants and the soils and the waters are all interconnected. And I think part of what Leopold is trying to do here is to change our way of seeing. So he's not so much laying out an argument that has a conclusion based on certain premises that he's able to infer toward the conclusion, but rather to get us to see ourselves as part of this interdependent, biotic community. And his hope is that getting us to see ourselves in this different light, a change in our behavior might come as a matter of course, rather than as something we need to be argued into.